In the Seven Kingdoms, crowns are forged not just of gold, but of steel, blood, and betrayal. 5 kings will rise, and only one shall claim the Iron Throne. But before the dust settles, battles will be fought, oaths will be broken, and legends will be born. This is the War of the 5 Kings and the Battle of the Whispering Wood. The wind over Westeros carried the scent of war. In the halls of Winterfell, on the rocky shores of Dragonstone, in the flowered gardens of Highgarden, and in the shadow of the Iron Throne itself, the realm trembled beneath the ambitions of kings. 5 men, 5 crowns, and 1 kingdom too small to hold them all. It began with a death. Lord Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, had been executed in King's Landing under the orders of the boy king Joffrey Baratheon. His head had been set upon a spike, his name branded as traitor. Yet to the north, Ned Stark was no traitor. He was a father, a lord, a man of honor. His blood cried out for vengeance, and his son, Robb Stark, answered. Ravens flew from Winterfell, calling the banners. From the Frostfangs to the neck, the houses of the north gathered their men, sharpening swords and oiling mail. At only 17 years old, Robb Stark rode at the head of his army, his direwolf Grey Wind at his side, bound for the Riverlands where his mother's kin, House Tully, were under siege. But Robb was not alone in raising arms. In the storm-lashed fortress of Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon Robert Stern, unyielding brother, declared that Joffrey was no true heir at all, but the product of an incestuous union between Queen Cersei and her twin brother Jaime Lannister. The Iron Throne, Stannis claimed, was his by right, and he would have it no matter the cost. In the far south, Renly Baratheon, young, handsome, and beloved by the people, placed a crown upon his own head. Backed by the wealth and power of House Tyrell, Renly claimed not only the throne, but the hearts of thousands who would rally to his banner. To the west, in the Iron Islands, Balon Greyjoy heard the chaos of the mainland and saw opportunity. Proclaiming himself king of the Isles and the North, he prepared his longships to raid and reeve while the great lords warred among themselves. And in King's Landing, the Lannisters tightened their grip. Tywin Lannister commanded the main host in the Riverlands, burning and pillaging to break the Tullys and draw out the northern host. In the capital, Queen Cersei schemed to secure her son's rule while Joffrey reveled in cruelty. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, led a separate force in the west, striking deep into the Riverlands in hopes of breaking the Tully resistance before Robb could arrive. The Riverlands became the crucible where these ambitions would meet. Villages burned, rivers ran red, and the cries of the small folk rose to the heavens. But in the smoke and ruin, alliances were forged. Robb Stark met with his bannermen at Moat Cailin, then at the Twins, where Lord Walder Frey's bridge offered passage over the green fork of the Trident. The Freys, ever calculating, agreed to let the northern host pass at a price. Promises were made that would echo darkly in years to come. Robb's scouts brought grim tidings. Jaime Lannister had besieged River Run, the Tully seat, and the garrison could not hold much longer. Tywin's host lay to the south, too strong to meet head-on, but if River Run fell, Robb's campaign would crumble before it truly began. There was only one choice: outthink the lions. By torchlight in a war tent, Robb spread a map before his lords. The plan was bold: split the army. A small force under Roose Bolton would march south to engage Tywin, drawing his attention and pinning his army. Robb himself would lead the larger part west, crossing the river at a secret ford to strike at Jaime's camp from the shadows of the Whispering Wood. Men murmured at the risk, but Robb's voice was steady. "We will free River Run," he said, "and take the Kingslayer." It was more than a promise. It was a vow. The march to the ford was silent but tense. Armor was wrapped in cloth to muffle its rattle, and campfires were left unlit. Grey Wind padded ahead, his nose to the wind, a silent shadow in the dark. The river crossing was treacherous, the current strong, but the men waded through with grim determination. On the far bank, the Whispering Wood loomed, its branches heavy with leaves that rustled even without wind, as if the forest itself conspired to keep its secrets. Through that darkness, the Stark host crept closer to the lion's den. Jaime Lannister's campfires glimmered ahead, scattered among the trees. The golden lion banners hung limp in the still air. Lannister sentries paced lazily, unaware that death was threading through the woods toward them. Robb gave the signal, a sharp whistle barely louder than the breath of the night, and the wolves fell upon the lions. Moving into the chaos, tension, and emotions of the Battle of the Whispering Wood, the attack began like a nightmare. Out of the shadows came the howl of a dire wolf, low, primal, and close. Then the silence shattered. Northern war cries split the night as men burst from the undergrowth, swords and axes flashing in the firelight. The Lannister sentries had no time to raise an alarm. Grey Wind lunged at the first man he saw, his jaws closing on a throat in a spray of blood. Archers loosed from behind trees, arrows thudding into startled guards before they could reach for their horns. Panic swept the camp like a gale. Jaime's men scrambled from their tents, some half-dressed, some without weapons, as Stark riders surged between the fires. The clash of steel rang out in every direction. Horses screamed, the sharp tang of blood and smoke filled the air. Robb rode at the front, his sword raised, his young face set in a mask of cold focus. He did not shout in rage. He called orders measured, precise, each word a stone in the wall of their advance. His bannermen fought at his side. Great John Umber's booming laugh carried over the din as he cleaved through men like a woodsman felling trees. Rickard Karstark's sons pressed forward with grim ferocity, their blades red almost before the first charge was spent. The Whispering Wood became a maze of violence. Fires cast flickering light on twisting branches, making every shadow seem alive. Lannister knights tried to rally, but the Starks' momentum was relentless. From every direction, horsemen and foot soldiers closed in, driving the enemy inward. In the heart of the melee, Jaime Lannister fought like the warrior his legend claimed him to be. His sword moved with impossible speed, catching the glint of firelight as it turned aside blow after blow. Men fell around him, but he pressed forward, seeking the enemy commander. He cut down a Karstark man-at-arms, then an Umber bannerman, his golden hair loose and wild, his face lit with a dangerous grin. But no man could fight a tide forever. The Starks' net drew tight. Grey Wind darted in and out of the fray, tearing into men who strayed too far from their lines. Robb circled wide, cutting off Jaime's retreat. With a sudden surge, the northern riders broke through the last line of Lannister defenders and closed around the Kingslayer. Jaime's horse reared as Robb rode in. For a heartbeat, the two locked eyes, Robb's cold with purpose, Jaime's bright with defiance. Then a dozen spears leveled at the Kingslayer's chest. His sword did not falter, but even the best swordsman cannot fight on all sides at once. Great John Umber roared, "Yield, Kingslayer!" But Jaime spat, "I'll not be taken by the likes of you." He spurred forward, cutting one man down, wounding another, before the weight of numbers dragged him from the saddle. The fight was brutal steel on steel, fists, boots, snarls, but in the end, Jaime was pinned, his sword wrenched from his grasp. The battlefield stilled in pockets, the Lannisters surrendering as the news spread. The Kingslayer was taken. In the shadows of the Whispering Wood, under the watchful branches, Robb Stark had won his first great victory. The captives were gathered, the dead counted, and the wounded tended. Robb stood over Jaime, who knelt in chains, still wearing that infuriating half-smile. "Send word to River Run," Robb told his men. "Tell them the siege is broken." And when the dawn broke over the riverlands, the mist rising from the Trident, it found a changed war. The young wolf had drawn first blood against the lions, and all the realm would hear of it. Carrying us from the victory at the Whispering Wood into the fall of the siege of River Run and the next. Dangerous moves in the War of the Five Kings. The night after the battle was thick with the sounds of the living and the dead. Men groaned under the care of healers, horses stamped nervously at the scent of blood, and the whispered prayers of the survivors drifted through the camp like smoke. Robb did not sleep. He walked among the wounded, speaking quietly to those who could still answer, pausing by those who could not. He stopped to kneel beside one of Lord Karstark's sons, whose face was pale as snow, but whose breath still stirred the air. "He fought bravely," Robb said, meeting Rickard Karstark's grim eyes. The Lord nodded once, saying nothing. In war, some wounds never healed. Word of Jaime Lannister's capture spread like wildfire through the Riverlands. To the small folk, it was a miracle proof that the young wolf could stand against the greatest knight alive. To the lords of the realm, it was a shift in the balance of power. Riverrun was no longer alone. At dawn, Robb rode with a column of men toward the Tully stronghold. The road to Riverrun was littered with signs of Lannister presence-burned farms, trampled fields, the charred remains of cottages where families once lived. Every blackened ruin was a silent accusation, and with each one Robb's resolve hardened. They reached the siege lines by mid-morning. Catapults and trebuchets stood idle, their crews staring in disbelief as Stark banners appeared on the horizon. The Lannister camp, once so ordered, now sagged with defeat. Some men fled outright, abandoning their posts, while others huddled in confusion. Lord Tywin was far away, leading his main host in the south. In his absence, the Lannister commanders at Riverrun had no taste for being caught between Stark riders and Tully defenders. Robb wasted no time. His cavalry swept around the outer lines, cutting off retreat toward the west. Arrows darkened the sky, raining down on the siege engines. Northern infantry advanced with shields locked, driving the Lannister soldiers back step by step. From the walls of Riverrun, Lord Hosted Tully's banners waved, and a horn blast echoed across the field. The gates opened, and the defenders surged out in a sudden counterattack. Between Stark steel and Tully resolve, the siege shattered. When the fighting was done, the bodies of Lannister men lay in heaps along the embankments. Those who surrendered were stripped of weapons and sent under guard to makeshift cages. Riverrun's walls, battered but unbroken, stood as a symbol of resistance. That night, the great hall of Riverrun was lit with hundreds of candles. Catelyn Stark embraced her uncle, Sir Brynden Blackfish Tully, whose hard face softened only for her. "You've given us back our home," he said, clasping Robb's arm in approval. Yet even amid the victory, shadows lingered. Jaime Lannister, their greatest prize, was a dangerous hostage. His capture would enrage Tywin, and Tywin's vengeance would be swift and merciless. Robb knew it. Catelyn knew it. And in the quiet corners of the hall, men spoke of what would come next, how the lions would answer the bite of the wolf. Beyond the walls of Riverrun, the War of the Five Kings was only beginning. In the west, Tywin Lannister rallied his armies. In the south, Renly Baratheon and Stannis Baratheon both claimed the Iron Throne. In the north, whispers spread that perhaps the young wolf should not bend the knee to any king at all. And in the darkness between battles, the ravens carried tidings that would soon shake the realm. Eddard Stark's fate in King's Landing was sealed, and the cost of war would grow higher still. Where the story darkens after the victories, and the war takes on an entirely new purpose. The victory at Riverrun had barely settled into memory when the news arrived. A single raven from King's Landing. It came in the dead of night, its wings black against the moonlight, its eyes glinting like shards of obsidian. Robb broke the seal himself. The parchment bore the royal crest, but the words within were a blade to the heart. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, was dead, beheaded on the orders of King Joffrey Baratheon. Catelyn's scream tore through the quiet halls of Riverrun, raw and unrestrained. It was not the cry of a lady of a great house, but the wail of a mother and a wife who had lost more than she could bear. Robb stood frozen, the paper crumpling in his hand, his mind refusing the truth. In the great hall, the lords of the north gathered as the news spread like wildfire. Men who had followed Robb for honor now called for vengeance. Great voices thundered curses upon the Lannisters. Others spoke of marching on King's Landing without pause. But Robb did not rage. He did not weep. He stood at the head of the table, his eyes colder than the snows of the Frostfangs. "We will have justice," he said at last, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall. By morning, the war had changed. No longer was it about freeing the Riverlands or trading hostages for Ned's release. This was now a war for the North's survival and for the honor of House Stark. The council convened in Riverrun Solar. The Blackfish, Lord Rickard Karstark, Great John Umber, and other bannermen argued fiercely. Some still spoke of bending the knee to Renly or Stannis, believing a southern alliance could secure their future. Others spat at the thought, insisting the North should answer to no one but its own. It was the Great John who finally slammed his fist onto the table, so hard the goblets rattled. Why should we bow to any southern king? The Starks were kings in the North for thousands of years before the dragons came. Let the South have their Iron Throne, we have our own. One by one, voices joined in agreement. The old words rang out, echoing in the chamber. The king in the North. They crowned Robb Stark then and there, the young wolf becoming the first king in the North in centuries. The sound of their swords striking the floor in salute shook the stone beneath their feet. Catelyn watched with a mix of pride and fear in her son, fear for the storm he had just sworn to face. Outside the Solar, the war drums began again. Messengers rode to spread word of the North's declaration. Tywin Lannister would not take this lightly. Already, his armies were on the move, gathering like storm clouds on the western horizon. Robb knew that every victory from here on would be harder won. His enemies were many Tywin's hosts, the newly crowned kings in the south, and the endless tide of southern politics. But there was no turning back. Winter was coming, and the North would meet it not as subjects, but as a free kingdom once more, where the war shifts into high-stakes maneuvers, deception, and the approach to the Battle of the Whispering Wood. The weeks that followed Robb's coronation as king in the North were marked by fire and steel. His hosts split into smaller, faster war bands, striking deep into the Westerlands. At night, the hills blazed with the light of burning villages. The scent of smoke carried on the wind for miles. Lannister patrols vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. Roads that had been safe under Tywin's watch now ran red with the blood of his men. But the Lannisters were not idle. Tywin, ever the master strategist, pulled his main force east, tightening his grip on the Riverlands, and sending word to his son Jaime to keep the pressure on River Run. If River Run fell, Robb's campaign would lose its heart. Catelyn returned to her father's halls and tried to counsel her son toward caution. "Strike too far, and you'll stretch your men thin," she warned. "The West is a lion's den. You may win battles, but every step deeper brings you closer to their claws." But Robb's eyes had taken on the sharpness of a blade. "We can't afford to let them breathe, Mother. Every day we keep Tywin guessing is a day the North holds its ground." It was then that a plan began to take shape, one bold enough to turn the tide in their favor. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer himself, commanded a host outside River Run. If Robb could capture him, the leverage would be immeasurable. Jaime was not just Tywin's son. He was the pride of House Lannister, their most fearsome sword. Robb met with his most trusted commanders under cover of darkness. Around a rough-hewn table, they spread maps and whispered strategy by candlelight. The Blackfish traced a line with his finger along the forking river, marking the place where their forces could vanish into the dense thickets. "The Whispering Wood," he said, "thick enough to hide an army until it's too late." The plan was dangerous. Robb would bait Jaime into pursuing a seemingly vulnerable force, then surround him in the forest. Every man at the table knew the risk one misstep, and the young wolf could find himself the prey instead of the hunter. The night before the march, the camp was restless. Horses stamped and snorted in the dark, the scent of wet earth heavy in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled a sound that made even the bravest men glance toward the shadowed tree line. Robb stood apart from the others, his direwolf gray wind at his side. The great beast's eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, its low growl rumbling like distant thunder. Robb placed a hand on its fur, staring out into the black beyond the camp. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "the lion will hear the wolf's teeth. The battle of the Whispering Wood." The night was moonless. The forest loomed ahead, a dark mass of shadow and whisper, its leaves shivering in the faint wind as if the trees themselves knew blood was about to be spilled. The only light came from the dying embers of a few carefully concealed campfires, their glow barely touching the edges of the men who waited in silence. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted, a sound that might have been nothing on any other night, but here it was the signal. From the west, the faint thrum of hooves echoed through the earth. Slow at first, like a heartbeat, then growing louder, heavier, until it became the thunder of 1,000 horses. Jaime Lannister was coming. In the shadows, Robb Stark knelt beside Grey Wind, his hand gripping the direwolf's thick fur. The beast was tense, ears pricked toward the sound of the oncoming host. Robb's breath was steady, but his heart was pounding in time with the hoofbeats. Around him, men gripped spear and sword, their armor muted under dark cloaks, faces drawn tight with anticipation. The Blackfish crouched nearby, whispering to the nearest scouts, "Wait until they're inside the wood." When the vanguard was deep in the trees, a horn split the night, sharp, fierce, and wild. From every shadow, Stark men burst forward. Spears bristled, swords flashed, and arrows hissed through the air. The forest exploded into chaos. Jaime's horse reared, screaming as the Kingslayer drew his sword, eyes flashing with sudden fury. "With me!" he bellowed, cutting down the first man who dared to close with him. But the trap was already sprung. The Whispering Wood was alive with wolves. Grey Wind leapt into the fray, a streak of gray fur and snapping jaws, tearing through a Lannister knight before the man could even scream. Men shouted in panic as the direwolf's howl carried over the clash of steel. From the north flank, Robb drove his horse straight into the melee, his sword arcing in the dark. He cut through a Lannister rider, then another, his voice rising above the din. "Winterfell!" The fighting was brutal and close. No room for cavalry charges. No space for clean maneuvers. The trees hemmed them in, forcing the fight into a press of bodies, shields, and desperate thrusts. Lannister knights found their horses useless among the trunks, and many were dragged down by pikes before they could even dismount. Jaime fought like a man possessed, his blade moving with deadly grace. Every swing claimed a foe. Every step carved a path through the chaos. But the Stark lines closed around him like the jaws of a snare. The Blackfish himself rode at Jaime, their swords clashing in a ringing storm of steel. Blow for blow, they matched each other, until a Stark spear took Jaime's horse in the flank. The beast collapsed, throwing the Kingslayer hard to the ground. Before he could rise, half a dozen Stark soldiers were on him, weapons leveled. Jaime's sword flashed one last time, but Robb's voice cut through the noise. "Take him alive!" The Kingslayer was dragged to his knees, breathing hard, blood on his lip, golden hair plastered to his face. His eyes met Robb's across the clearing, sharp, cold, and filled with unspoken challenge. And then it was over. The Whispering Wood was silent again, save for the groans of the wounded and the low savage panting of Grey Wind. The young wolf had his prize. Where this one victory shifts the entire balance of the War of the Five Kings, that's where the tension moves from swords to thrones. The night after the battle smelled of blood, smoke, and pine. The clearing was littered with the dead. Crimson cloaks tangled with northern gray, armor dented and torn, faces pale in the moonlight. Somewhere in the shadows, men moved silently, tending to the wounded, whispering names of the fallen. Jaime Lannister sat bound in the center of camp, his hands shackled, his fine golden armor dulled by mud and blood. Despite the ropes and the bruises, he held himself with the poise of a knight who still believed he might win. His smirk, faint but unshaken, was the armor he wore now. Robb Stark stood over him, a boy in years but a commander in bearing. His cloak was spattered with the knight's work, his sword still uncleaned. Grey Wind sat at his side, yellow eyes fixed on the Kingslayer with an animal's unblinking threat. "You fought well," Robb said, his voice steady, "but you're my prisoner now." Jaime's smirk deepened just enough to sting. "Then let's hope you know what to do with me, boy." It was not just a victory, it was a statement. The young wolf had captured the Lannisters' greatest warrior, their most feared commander, the brother of the queen herself. In the span of one night, the balance of the War of the Five Kings had shifted like a ship caught in a sudden storm. Word of the battle raced ahead of the Raven messengers. By the time the sun rose, campfires across the Riverlands were alive with whispers. The North had taken the Kingslayer. In River Run, Catelyn Stark heard the news with both relief and dread. Her son's triumph meant hope. Hope for Sansa and Arya's safety. Hope for the North's cause. But it also meant the Lannisters would rage like a wounded beast. She could almost hear the ripples spreading. In King's Landing, Cersei would feel the blow like a knife between the ribs. In Casterly Rock, Tywin would already be plotting vengeance. And plot he did. For every victory, there is an answer. The Lannisters tightened their grip on the Riverlands, striking hard at Robb's supply lines. Spies were sent, alliances tested, and envoys dispatched with honeyed words and veiled threats. The war was no longer just fought with swords. It was fought in letters, promises, and secrets whispered behind closed doors. Yet for the moment, in the cold heart of the Northmen's camp, there was a sense of triumph. Men toasted by firelight, singing songs of the young wolf, the boy who outwitted the Kingslayer. Robb, however, stood apart from the celebration. He looked across the camp to where Jaime sat in the shadows, guarded by two men with spears. The war was far from over, and Robb knew it. Capturing Jaime had won him a night of victory, but it had also painted a mark on his back that would never fade while the lion still had teeth. The game had changed, and in Westeros, every move came with a price. The days after the battle were filled with a strange quiet. The Whispering Woods had lived up to their name. The trees still seemed to murmur, as though carrying the voices of the men who had fallen there. Ravens took flight from the Northmen's camp in every direction, bearing the news that would shake the Seven Kingdoms. In King's Landing, the Red Keep felt suddenly smaller. Cersei Lannister received the Raven's words in the privacy of her solar. The Kingslayer, her brother, her sword hand in all but name, was a prisoner of the Starks. She did not cry. Cersei's grief was forged into steel the moment she read the message. The court watched her more carefully now, for the Queen's wrath was quiet, and quiet wrath was the most dangerous kind. Far to the west, Tywin Lannister sat in his war tent, the gold and crimson of his banners rippling in the breeze. He read the Raven's letter without expression, then folded it neatly. Around him, his commanders waited for his orders. "The boy has won a battle," Tywin said at last, his voice like cold iron. "We will make him regret it." But in the Northmen's camp, the air still carried the heat of victory. Men sharpened their blades with a new pride, and sentries stood taller. The young wolf's name was now a song carried from camp to camp, cavern to tavern. And yet, Robb Stark did not sing. He knew too well that victory could be as dangerous as defeat. Every move now had to be sharper, every choice more cunning. The war had only begun. Stannis Baratheon would soon declare himself king. Renly Baratheon would crown himself in Highgarden splendor. Balon Greyjoy would eye the seas with ambition, and Joffrey Baratheon still sat the Iron Throne with Lannister power at his back. 5 kings, 1 realm. And the wolves, lions, stags, and krakens would all meet on the battlefield before the game was done. As the campfires burned low, Robb looked toward the east, toward the land still held by his enemies. Grey wind stirred at his side, sensing his master's thoughts. The war was not over. It had barely drawn its first breath, and somewhere beyond the hills, the wind carried a whisper, the sound of armies gathering, and of the 7 kingdoms sliding deeper into the chaos of the War of the 5 Kings. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the War of the 5 Kings and the Battle of the Whispering Wood, make sure to hit that like button, share this with fellow Game of Thrones fans, and subscribe for more epic stories from Westeros. Until next time, remember, in the Game of Thrones, you win or you die.